Hey all, this is James from TeaDB, bringing you another deep dive into a tea-related topic. So both Denny and I get asked pretty often, about how we brew tea. And while we've talked about it in some of our many episodes, including just the episodes about tea, as well as some of the special ones that I think we did a little bit more frequently early on, but I wanted to dive a little bit deeper and devote some time to really talking about what we're thinking about, or what I'm thinking about when I'm brewing pu'erh. So this episode is specifically devoted to just breaking down what I'm thinking about, what my goals are. For those of you that are interested in those topics, I also recommend checking out the Raw and Ripe Tea Basics episodes that Denny and I filmed a few years ago. I think those are worth watching for sure, and a bit more in the normal form of the episode. So please let me know what you think of this episode. Really appreciate any feedback. So pu'erh, specifically raw pu'erh, is a tea that I think benefits a lot from small vessels, such as this one, filled with lots of tea and short steep times. One thing that you'll find really quickly if you sort of dive deeper into the Gong Fu world is that normal people think that we use incredibly small vessels, and this is definitely true. Things like this blue pot I've had, which is like my largest vessel, I've had people say, "Oh, look at how small and how cute it is," when it's actually quite large for my functional vessels. Okay, so this episode we won't be tasting anything, but I'll be just showing some clips of me brewing and talking sort of generally how I brew. Now, to be clear, I definitely don't consider myself to be a master brewer or tea master or anything like that. I'm more or less just a guy that has brewed a bunch of tea over the past 7 years and happens to like and drink pu'erh almost daily. And while I think I have some things that are worth listening to, especially for newer folks, I'm definitely not pretending to be the king of tea or anything like that. So please take me at my word and don't overinflate any of this. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to talk about is ratio. So typically I like to use what I think is a pretty standard and, in my opinion, pretty middle-of-the-road ratio. So for each vessel, you should have some idea of how many milliliters it is. Usually when you buy it, the vendors will tell you online, or you can measure it. Quite easy to measure. So I will use, for every milliliter of space you have in there, I will use 1 gram of space for 1 gram of leaf for every 15 milliliters of space. So this, I believe, is 90 or 95 milliliters. So for this, I would use 6 grams, maybe 6.2, 6.3. I don't think you need to be fairly too anal about it, but you want to get, at least I tried to get kind of in that basic range. So you can definitely find more extreme ratios. For instance, you can find some people that like to brew 1 gram for every 10 milliliters, or people that like to brew 1 gram for every 20 milliliters. So I think this ratio sort of fits in the middle. So you could definitely start with this and go up or scale down depending on what you do like. And I will talk about vessel size later, but my vessels tend to be around 100 milliliters, 90 to 100 milliliters, which means I'm usually using 6 to 6.5 grams. Those of you that know that the steep times are kept quite short to start. You can watch any of the episodes we've done on any of these teas and just see how I brew, how Denny brews. We both brew slightly different, but I'd say we're kind of in the same... We're not dramatically different, we'll put it that way. Okay, so another way, and I think this will be sort of the remainder of the episode, is talking about the different types of pu'erh and how you would brew those, what you would look for, and how you would brew those maybe a little differently from one another. So the first type is young raw pu'erh. And I think it's worth noting to start with that there is a pretty large range of young pu'erh. Within it, you can have boutique that are usually under vendors' own labels, such as like White Tea, Yunnan Sourcing Brand, Shiza Hao, Yangqin Hao. Those would all qualify as boutique. And within that boutique, you have quite a large range to different areas, different regions. But you could also have sort of the more traditional style tea that's been produced for a long time, sort of more factory style tea. So Young Pu'erh is something I don't drink a lot of. Neither type is something I will look to drink super regularly. But this is probably one of the most consumed types in sort of the Western pu'erh tea circles. It is also pu'erh at its greenest. So you are drinking the tea that has, I'm not sure if this would be a consensus view, but in my opinion, it has the greatest potential for being really strong and edgy, and I think an especially high potential for bitterness and astringency. Those of you that brewed it before will know that it brews a lighter color, so that can be a little deceptive. Lighter, often sort of yellow, a little bit more transparent than pu'erh as it gets a little older. And your basic goal when brewing this is to brew something that is flavorful with being the appropriate levels of bitterness and astringency. So I think you'll find people that have really varying preferences in this category, I think more so than maybe most other commonly consumed categories of teas. Some people like it really strong, while others won't want hardly any bitterness at all. So for me, it's usually a balance of hitting that. For me, I don't try to brew totally around bitterness. I think that you would need to make too many concessions and you would end up with weaker tea as a result. But you definitely don't want to make a brew that just makes you pucker up completely either. Some people will. I personally do not. And I think this type of tea is especially really difficult to brew Western style, and I think it benefits a lot from sort of this small vessel, a lot of leaf setup. That's my opinion. So I will typically brew Young Pu'erh with a gaiwan or the shibo that I use, and I do not use a pot super commonly. This really allows me to have a lot of control over the pour time. I recently did a Inbetweenisode on pour time, and one of the big takeaways is that you can really control the flow a lot easier, and you can potentially pour quite a bit faster when you are using a gaiwan when compared with something like a pot. For instance, this big blue pot that I have pours quite slowly. It is also quite large. Okay. And the other advantage that these vessels, such as a gaiwan, an easy gaiwan, a shibo, will have is that you can more clearly appreciate the higher notes and the aromas of it. It gives you really quick access. If you're brewing in porcelain, you have a pretty clear look at sort of the liqueur. So if you're familiar with, hey, when this tea gets like to X color, like to this shade of yellow, then I know that it's good to brew. Then that can be an advantage as well. So again, I will use my typical 1 gram to 15 milliliter ratio, and I'll start by keeping my first 3 to 4 steeps usually quite short. I would say definitely under 10 seconds. You do have the flexibility to brew longer. I know some people do like to brew longer. And I usually start out pretty close to a flash steep. If you're starting out with pu'erh, I'd recommend starting with that and just seeing where you end up landing. I think for the most part, people are more used to tea that you're brewing for a minute or 2 minutes. So starting with something that might seem absurdly low, but a high ratio, I think is a good place to start and just to learn. This is also the category where I think some people like to brew at lower temperatures. I personally do not do this. I like to brew off a boil all the time, except when I'm brewing green tea. So my preference is to regulate the strength of the tea, the bitterness of the tea with steep time. But I will say for this category in particular, it is reasonably common to do it at a lower temperature. So feel free to experiment with that, see what you like. So next up is semi-aged raw pu'erh. So there's a lot of factors to sort of determining when a tea is semi-aged. I see some, in my opinion, vendors make the, in my opinion, quite silly decision to start labeling tea that is 2 or 3 years old as aged. I don't think that's aged. I think that is still young. So for me, if you're just looking for a single year marker, keeping in mind that this is a simplification, that I like to use, around 7 years, 7 to 10 years is sort of the mark when you could count something as semi-aged. And for me, this category lasts till 20 to 25 years. A lot depends on the storage. This episode is not on storage, so we're really going to not dive too deep into that. Stuff that's usually between 2 to 7 years can be kind of weird and, in my opinion, a little bit awkward sometimes. So for me, waiting until 7 years for pu'er helps to sometimes develop a bit more clarity. I think tasting it when it's outside of that awkward stage allows you to more clearly see the tea for what it is and what it will be in the future. All right, so the difference between this and young pu'er is that age tends to soften and mellow the tea out. This, again, depends a bit on storage conditions, but this is generally what will happen as a tea ages. So you will expect the color of this to no longer be quite as light as yellow. You would expect it to darken and deepen. At lightest, I would say that semi-aged pu'er would be a very much darker yellow. More typically, especially if we're talking about sort of like Taiwan, more humid place storage, orange or even red. In my opinion, the tea should still have an edge to that, but the level of that can depend. And your goal is really quite similar to brewing young pu'er. It's to balance the brew. So in my opinion, and how I brew, is I try to still give the tea some strength to it. And I think that's a pretty normal and natural thing for raw pu'er, young, semi-aged, or even more aged. But you really want to balance the potency with other notes. So a lot of people will brew this a little differently. I'm also more willing to brew in different devices. I would say that these days I tend to brew in pots such as this one. This is actually a semi-aged raw pu'er pot. 80% of the time, 85% of the time. I'm also willing to use a gaiwan. I prefer the pot slightly, but there's no reason to be too anal about it. You do not absolutely need to have a pot for it. You can enjoy your tea perfectly fine with something cheap and functional like a gaiwan. Yeah, so generally steep time kept very similar to young pu'er. I will brew the first few at under 10 seconds or so, and then kind of go to taste. Generally, as the tea mellows out, you can push it just a little bit more. I think the amount that you want to push it depends a lot on the actual tea itself. You can have semi-aged pu'er that is a lot more mellow than other semi-aged pu'er. But I think those offer pretty good just starting parameters. The other thing to note about sort of what I'm thinking about when I'm brewing is that my pots do tend to pour a little bit slower than my gaiwans and shibos. And I think that makes sense given that I tend to gravitate towards these for the semi-aged pu'er, a tea that is in theory a little bit more softened and mellowed out than young pu'er. Temperature, I have stronger beliefs here than the early category. Again, I use boil all the time. I think you should use boil. I think you should always use boil for semi-aged pu'er. I think if a vendor is telling you to use something less than that, I would immediately be pretty suspicious of that. Just because I think a proper semi-aged pu'er should definitely be able to take boiling water. Okay, so the last type of raw pu'er is aged raw. And I think this definition is tricky, is semi-aged. And I think you're going to get a lot of different answers on it. But if you're looking for a simple year marker, I tend to go 20 to 25 years. And in general, I think this category is not particularly well understood or consumed in the West. But if we think about it, probably 20 years ago, this type of pu'er, and specifically traditionally stored pu'er, was probably the most consumed type of raw pu'er, not pu'er, but raw pu'er, around. So this is by no means a new thing or something that people are just discovering. It just happens to be a little more scarce in the scene at this point. And again, huge amount of variance in this. the level of maturation is not just determined by the amount of years. A traditionally stored tea that is, say, 12 years old might actually be quite a bit more mature than something that is dry stored in Kunming for 18 years or even twice as long. So not an easy category to define at all. And so if we're talking about raw pu'erh, even for traditionally stored pu'erh, there's going to be a bit more rawness, liveliness, and vitality in tea than your ripe tea in general, unless it has been stored extremely wet. So even aged tea, especially dry stored aged tea, could still definitely have an edge to it. So if you get that, I wouldn't say that's necessarily a red flag. I think it just depends a lot. I think the color you'll get will usually be red, and you could get stronger shades of red depending on how old it is. So yeah, that tends to be my experience with more aged raw. And another thing is, I think in general, while brewing is never the easiest thing, I think in general, aged raw pu'erh is easier to brew than the two other types. There's less bitterness to brew around, and you can really brew it to taste. You can push it a little bit longer. I'll usually start with a pretty similar steep time of under 10 seconds or so, but I think if I have a cake of tea, I'll be definitely willing to experiment a little bit more, pushing the tea, even trying it out in larger vessels and that sort of thing. Temperature, even more than semi-aged pu'erh, use boil. Please use a boil. And yeah, so 1 grams to 15 milliliters is my baseline here. More than the other two categories of raw pu'erh that we've just covered, I think this is a category where I'm also willing to use more leaf, maybe going 1 gram for every 12 milliliters. Yeah, so in general, I think it's pretty easy category to brew. And you can do it similar to the other ones, maybe just extending just a little bit in terms of steep time. Okay, so we are now going to talk about ripe pu'erh. And in some strange ways, we can sort of think of this as an extension of more aged raw. In fact, this is why this whole genre of tea was invented, even though it is consumed far more frequently in Western circles than aged raw pu'erh, is that ripe was trying to mimic sort of, in some ways, aged raw, traditionally stored raw. For ripe tea, those of you that have not had it will brew red to black. There are different sorts of ripe pu'erh that have been fermented for less long and might brew, lighter shades of red, but really not going to focus on the sort of oddities. So these are sort of more general rules. Okay, so there's two ways that I will brew ripe pu'erh. So the first way is similar to raw, where I'll use, about 1 gram for every 15 milliliters that my vessel is. But I actually don't do ripe terribly often this way. There's a group of people that like to use even stronger ratios, 1 gram to 10 milliliters. You're going to get a really thick and syrupy brew. I guess the reasoning behind this is that ripe pu'erh, even more so than any of the types of raw, is difficult to make bitter. So you can really push it without being hit by a lot of mouth pucker or astringency or bitterness or anything like that. So you could use these sort of insane, really high leaf to water ratios for raw pu'erh too, but I think the audience for it will be a little bit less receptive to it in general. So the second brewing method that I probably use more often is actually a little bit lower of a leaf to water ratio, but in a larger vessel. So this is about, in my opinion, or I believe it's around 250 milliliters. So for this, I will use 8 or 9 grams of leaf. So I think that comes in quite a bit under what we would be using if we were using the 1 gram to 15 milliliter. And this pot also comes with the feature of pouring quite a bit slower. So even if you keep your steep still pretty short, there's a lot of time when the water is touching tea, especially when put into contrast with the other extreme, something like a gaiwan, where you can brew as short as just a few seconds of pour time. Temperature, again, I believe should always be kept at a boil or just off of it. Ripe is probably the easiest of all of these types of pu'erh to brew. Quite forgiving towards a heavy hand, and I think the easiest mistake is probably going too light for something like this. Yeah, so I think that those are the 4 different types of raw pu'erh. A couple last quick things I wanted to mention. Wanted to talk quickly about vessel size. Larger vessels, I talked a bit about this with Ripe. Generally, the larger the pot you'll use, you can scale down the leaf a little bit if you want to. Similar to how this large vessel for Ripe, I'm not using 1 gram to 15 milliliters. Generally, as you get the pot bigger, you can use just a little bit less leaf. So if you're brewing something for more people, then you would brew it that way. So in summation, I think that if I were to just honestly sum all of this, you can brew all 4 of these different genres of pu'erh pretty similarly. I'd say maybe about 75 to 80% similarly. If you just start everything out at the basic ratio of around 1 gram to 15 milliliters, use boiling water, and you start out with short steeps, I think you should probably get the gist of the tea. And from there, you can adjust to your taste, depending on your taste, the actual tea. Maybe you've brewed it before and you know it responds well to going a bit more intensely, so you could add more leaf, or you could brew for a little longer. Yeah, so that concludes this Inbetweenisode. Thank you to everyone for tuning in. Let me know how you liked it, and I will see you all next time. Cheers.